In 2009, for the first time ever, the United Nations sent one of its vice secretary generals to a meeting in China with the Daoists. Now, if one bears in mind that when I first started working with the Daoists in China in 1993 and went to their major temple complex, the headquarters of the China Daoist Association in the White Cloud Temple, there were no windows in the temple. There was no heating. Half of the buildings were still being used by the army for training. And there were at that time probably less than about 100 Daoist temples open in China. Now you're talking in terms of 50 to 60,000 temples in China. So it's been a gradual process of Daoism coming back to life in a sense. And part of that was undoubtedly the fact that Prince Philip was photographed in 1995 with the then head of the China Daoist Association. This was the front cover of the Times. And the support and interest of His Royal Highness in Daoism was quite extraordinary and has certainly made a huge difference to their status. But in 2009, the UN sent its most senior representative, particularly with regards to climate change, to a meeting at Hua Shan, one of the great historic centers of Daoism. And at that meeting, he heard something that, as he put it, and this is a chap called Olaf Schorven, for him completely changed how he understood climate change. And it was based on yin and yang. And he has quoted this seamlessly so many times since. Because the great Master Ren, old Master Ren, who was then the head of the China Daoist Association, in explaining why climate change was so important, put it into entirely Daoist traditional language. And he said, what we're doing is that we are taking yin, earthly materials, the fossil fuels, and by burning them recklessly, we are turning them into yang, the heavenly, if you like, the earth, the air forces. And so what we've done is, he says, we've completely shifted them from where they ought to be to where they do not belong. And the result of that is that the world is out of harmony. A very simple statement. And as somebody who has worked on climate change since 1991, for various reasons, for me, it also summed up the nub of the issue. We can get drowned in data and information, which is enormously important to understand sort of how it's happening, but not why. And the Daoist wisdom that this is basically about playing with primordial forces, yin and yang, and taking one and turning it into the other, and therefore disturbing the balance, that has actually reshaped how many within the UN have begun to think about this. And it's a gift, if you like, from Daoism. And then I want to take you to 2020, October 2020, when the Chinese Communist Party launched the outline of its next 5-year plan. And the Chinese Communist Party, in talking about the environment, and particularly about climate, but more broadly about biodiversity, about food security as well, cited that the Daoists of China were one of their key partners in developing a response in civil society, and that they placed within the Daoist domain responsibility for leadership on education, on awareness, and on, in a sense, bringing a series of traditional Chinese values to bear on this common concern, this concern for the whole planet. So how is it that we have moved from a situation in which the Daoists were almost extinct and their properties have been taken over, to a situation in which the Communist Party looks to them to be one of their major partners in actually creating a sustainable world? Well, to do this, we need to go back into Daoism to find out the roots of this. And I want to start with a story, one of my favorite stories, from the book of Lyza, probably compiled around about 300 AD, but drawing on much older traditions. And it's one of the three great books with sort of named authors. You have the 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗲𝗿𝘃, you have the 𝗃𝘃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗲, and you have the 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗃. And then the 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗃, there's a wonderful story of a very wealthy businessman who is going to set off on some long journey. And so he throws a party. And all the rich and the wealthy and the powerful turn up to this party, and it's an amazing feast. Huge array of foods, as anybody who's been to a big Chinese feast will know, way more than you can possibly eat. And then he stands up, the businessman stands up, and he, rather patronizingly, he says, "Isn't it wonderful the way that all the different creatures, the fish and the snakes and the cattle and the deer, how they keep their meat fresh, ready for us to eat? Isn't this wonderful?" And all the sort of dignitaries are kind of going, "Oh, yes, 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 how splendid, how splendid." And then the text says a 10-year-old boy stands up and says, "Rubbish. This is absolute rubbish. On that basis, given that mosquitoes like to bite us and drink our blood, and that tigers, if they could catch us, would crunch our bones and chew our flesh, does this mean that human beings were created in order to feed mosquitoes and tigers?" And in so doing, he pinpointed the ridiculousness of that claim that the whole of nature had been made for us. And instead said, no, actually we are part of nature. And if you want a quintessential Daoist insight, it's that. We are not apart from nature, we are a part of nature. And then we come to the great teachings about the Dao. Dao, of course, simply means the way. In any Chinese city, you'll see streets called Beijing Dao, Beijing Road. But it's also developed over many, many, many years a spiritual sense. And I'm just going to read from the 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗿𝗃𝗃, probably compiled round about the 6th century BC. And this is taken from chapter 25. Tao is great. It is greater than heaven, greater than the earth, greater than the king. These are the 4 great things, and the ruler is the least of them. Humanity is schooled by the earth, earth is taught by heaven, and heaven is guided by the Tao. And the Tao goes with what is absolutely natural. That's a part of it. That Daoism is about the fact that the universe operates on fundamental principles of balance and relationship. And that there is a hierarchy, but it is a natural hierarchy. And that frankly, human beings, even kings or even princes, as I used to remind Prince Philip, are pretty much at the bottom of that pile. And then the second quote I'm going to give you is from one of my favorite authors. I've translated both the 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗃 and this author, 𝗃𝘃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗃𝗃. 𝗃𝘃𝗃 probably lived round about 500, 400 BC. Amazing character, cryingly funny, very witty, postmodern. He used to push language until it collapsed. And in chapter 12, he says this. And this is about a key phrase, wu wei, which is very difficult to translate into English. It basically means actionless action, which sounds a contradiction in terms, but is more deep than that. And he says, the action of non-action is called heaven. The words of non-action are called virtue. To love all humanity and to bring success to them is called benevolence. To unite that which is not united is called greatness. To go beyond barriers and boundaries is called open-handedness. And this is the crucial line. To have a vast multitude of diverse things is called wealth. And that, again, absolutely captures the heart of Daoism, that it delights in diversity. It has no great problem with diversity at all. It wants diversity because that's a sign of the richness of nature, of which we are a part. And we can be a wonderful part of that diversity. And then I want to give one other text, very, very important text. Around about 200 AD, during the collapse of the Han dynasty, the Daoists actually set up a theocratic state, a religious state in what is now Sichuan province. And for almost 50 years, they ran their own, essentially, Daoist republic. And one of the things they produced out of that is a book called the 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗃, the book of the classic of great peace. And out of that came something called the 180 precepts. And the 180 precepts are basic ideas of how you should live. And within those 180 precepts are, as far as I am aware, the oldest listing of environmental actions of any faith in the world. So, number 36, you should not throw poisonous substances into lakes, rivers, and seas. 47, you should not wantonly dig holes in the ground and therefore destroy the earth. 53, you should not dry up wet marshes. 79, you should not fish or hunt and thereby harm and kill living beings. 180 precepts, of which at least half relates to how we relate to the rest of nature. Building on that basis has been the task that I and my Daoist colleagues have done over the last 30 years. And in 1995, the Daoists produced the first ever statement by Daoism on the environment, a very key fundamental statement. And I'll just quote two little pieces from it. There are generally two kinds of attitude towards the treatment of nature, as is said in another classic of Daoism, 𝗱𝗲𝗁𝗃𝗶𝗶𝗹𝘀, written in the 4th century AD. One attitude is to make full use of nature. The other is to observe and follow nature's way. Those who have only a superficial understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature will recklessly exploit nature. Those who have a deep understanding of the relationship will treat nature well and learn from it. Again, this is built into the heart of Daoism, and in writing their statement in order to show that they were really deeply understanding of nature, they had that quote. And then the second quote from this is that what Daoists consider to be true wealth is when a country has a vast diversity of species. So very, very powerful teachings indeed. And when we discovered all this, or when we worked with the Daoists, which is what we did with all the major faiths, was to help the faiths realize that they had great teachings, great wisdom, but that somehow this had got lost. It had got lost because in many cases they've been ridiculed by the Enlightenment, which basically elevated humanity to the sole purpose of everything, and therefore reduced as superstitious nonsense anything that saw that there might be a sacred, a vital dimension in other parts of nature. And one of the big breakthroughs that we had was when the Daoists issued their statement. And then we were invited by WWF Netherlands, who were building an eco-resort next door to one of the great sacred sites of Daoism, a sacred mountain called Hua Shan. And they said, look, we've got this temple next door. We're just wondering, could you do anything with the Daoists and help us to sort of build a spiritual atmosphere there? So we started work and we developed this, along with great help from Dutch philanthropists, developed this into an education center for the training of Daoist monks and nuns and priests in environmental action. And it runs to this day training programs. The temple was rebuilt using entirely traditional methods that are entirely sustainable, absolutely sustainable. And we were delighted it has become the training center for Daoists across China. Though one also has to appreciate that the great thing about Daoism is it has a very wicked sense of humor and it loves stories. In fact, when we were producing the program for the UN for their MOOC on green entrepreneurship, we had to explain to the rather earnest people at the UN that the reason why the Daoist entry was full of stories is that that's how Daoism shares its wisdom. But when we were in the process of designing this temple complex and education center, we had a meeting one day before they started building, and the local Communist Party official and the head of 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗃, which is the temple that has jurisdiction over this, came to see us. And they said, we're really sorry. You know how we said it needed 3 sections? We went, yes. They said, well, we got to make it 5. And we said, well, why have you got to make it 5 sections? And they said, well, you know that the 3 would have the 3 gods of 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗲𝗃. And we went, yes. And they said, well, they don't get on. So we need to have 2 other shrines between them where we put lesser gods so that they don't upset each other. So we kind of sighed and thought, okay. And this was put to us with great ardor by the local Communist Party official, who said, yeah, no, they don't get on at all. You've got to separate them. And thinking, okay, fair enough, right you are. And then just as they were about to go, the Dutch philanthropist who was funding this, who was a man for whom Daoism had brought him from a situation in which he had been one of the great industrialists of the Netherlands, and not a friend of unions. So he said, but just tell me, why are there 3 gods in the first case? To which the Communist Party official, again, with an absolutely straight face, said, oh, they work shifts, 8 hours on and So I did take great delight in turning to my dear friend Allard and saying, you realize you've just funded a bunch of unionized gods. And I just think one has to remember that Daoism has, the gods are fickle, they're funny, they're unpredictable. They are pretty good reflections of humanity, really. But it's become this major center. But let me just go back one step further than that, which is why work with faith in the first place, as Brian introduced. I've been working with the major religions of the world and with all the major environmental groups since 1985. I was Prince Philip's religious advisor literally until the day he died. We were working on a project actually with China a week before he died. Why work with faiths? Well, because they are the longest surviving, most sustainable organizations in the world. As faiths, we've outlived every dynasty. We've outlived every empire. We've outlived the League of Nations. We will outlive the UN. And when I was challenged about this at the UN on one occasion, in the presence then of the Chinese ambassador, I said, well, look, I'm a historian of China. I've translated the oldest history book of China for Penguin Classics, as well as the Daoist classics. And I know that in 300 years' time, when you take a 400-page history of China off a library bookshelf, you'll find the Chinese Communist Party dynasty period will be covered probably between pages 310 and 328, because other things will have happened. But the Daoists will still be protecting their sacred mountains, and the Buddhists will still be in the cities looking after those whom the system has failed through hospitality, through food, through medical care. In other words, if you want to build with something sustainable, political structures are not the most sustainable in the world. The faiths are. Wherever you go in the world, the faiths have been there for centuries or millennia, and will be there long after the things we think are important have gone. So I want to go back now, because in a sense, one of the most extraordinary things was the way in which work that we had done with the Daoists, creating, for example, the education center on 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, developing environmental programs, whole teaching programs, the Daoists themselves becoming very active on seeking to ban the use of bear gall, these horrendous traps that are used to milk the bears of their juices. Extraordinary cruelty. How would that move to a position in which the Chinese government actually welcomes the Daoists and builds them into their long-term plan? Well, it started in 2007 when we had been asked in the Alliance of Religions and Conservation by the Chinese government to bring together the Daoists, with the government to think about how to make a better China. And so we convened with the Chinese government the 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗃𝗃 Forum in 2007. And this was the first time that the Chinese government gave official approval to Daoism. And it was Ms. Liu Yandong, the vice chair of the National Committee on Chinese People's Political Consultancy Conference, one of those wonderful short acronyms that the Chinese Communist Party, indeed, as far as I can see, most Communist parties like to give. And she said, the wisdoms in the 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗃 are invaluable for present-day China. And this ancient Chinese worldview should return to the heart of Chinese society. In 2005, I had a meeting with the then Minister of Environment, who was called something like Industry and Forestry, and the Minister for Religion. And they said, we have a major problem. We have accidentally created the most selfish generation in China's history through the single child policy, but also we have destroyed pretty much any sense of what it is to be Chinese through the Cultural Revolution. So we need help, and we produced a deeply selfish generation, the little princesses, the little emperors, little empresses phenomenon. And they said, we've looked around, and the only place where we can still see that there is a deep sense of Chinese culture, what it is to be Chinese, and of community and of generosity is in the faiths. Is it possible that you, as an outside group, could convene a meeting in which we can meet with our own faiths and talk about how we can work side by side? So we convened that meeting, and at that meeting, the vice chair actually said, this needs to come back into the heart of Chinese culture. Then in 2009, the Daoists were part of a program we ran with the UN to create faith long-term plans. The Daoists created an 8-year plan on the environment, which they presented at Windsor Castle to Ban Ki-moon and to His Royal Highness Prince Philip. And in that, they built a whole series of rollout programs. So for example, they decided to commit to bringing young people into the countryside to understand nature. And they bring hundreds of thousands of young people into the countryside to understand how reliant you are living in the cities on the food, on the fresh air, all the things that we know and understand. And it really was a crucial understanding. And then in 2011, we had another event at the request of the Chinese Communist Party. And at this, one of the speakers was the head of the State Administration for Religious Affairs. And he said, he noted that humanity needed the wisdoms of the old sages more than ever. Quote, these wisdoms are close to the essence of the world, unlike the twisted age we live in today. It is clear that all levels of the political establishment not only accept Daoism, but regard it as a source of wisdom and inspiration for the government of the nation. There is a real sense that without that deep other understanding, the materialist world will just run away with things. And this is something that we're finding for most of the faiths. I'm here in the Vatican because the Pope in 2015 issued the first ever encyclical letter on the environment to the Catholic world, and that has changed the Catholic world. They are now amongst some of the most active groups. But the Daoists were there a lot before that. Now there's a new plan from the Daoists, which will be launched in October this year, another long-term plan. This now involves a very different Daoist world. Tens of thousands of temples have reopened. Tens of thousands of the very wealthy like to donate to Daoism. So Daoism has become quite a major stakeholder. It's got heavy investments. Jack Ma is a devout Daoist and has funded many things. It's a very changed world. Just to give you a perspective, we work also with Christian groups and Catholic groups in China, as well as Buddhist. And there is an organization of 300 Protestant millionaires who meet in order to try and work out what on earth they should do with this money for the good of the people and the good of nature. And a similar movement is coming through Daoism. What does it mean to be a Daoist with these wonderful teachings? How can we live these teachings? How can we use the extraordinary wealth undreamt of by the parents of many of these people, let alone the grandparents? How can we mobilize this? And so the new plan builds into this a whole element on investments. It builds in a whole dimension on practical action, on lifestyles, and so forth. Hence, the importance to the Chinese Communist Party. And we have the great joy of working with an organization, the China Biodiversity Council Green Development Fund, CBC-GDF. And they are one of those organizations which is partly government, partly civil society. They are the group that takes many of the Chinese industries to court for pollution, a very bold move, not always one that is welcomed by the local authorities. And they, as a very practical environmental group, one of the biggest in China, have basically said, we need to work with the faiths. And so for the last 5 years, they've been our major partner, because they, again, rather like Miss Liu back in 2007, are saying, without this Daoist wisdom at the heart of our culture, we're just going to be repeating the mistakes of a materialist Western world. We have a deeper wisdom, a deeper knowledge, a deeper understanding. That is what should be at the heart of our work. And indeed, President Xi Jinping, when he spoke at UNESCO in, I think, about 2016, said the great gift of China is to bring Daoist wisdom to the world. So two other things briefly, and then throw it open for discussion. One of the things that we helped develop around the world is green pilgrimage. Now, we did a survey of the sacred mountains, the 9 great sacred mountains, the 4 Buddhist, the 5 Daoist, between 1995 and 1998. And it was an important survey because we were able to prove that where there were monks, either Daoist or Buddhist, on the mountains, the biodiversity was better protected. Because frankly, state wardens of national parks go home in the evenings. Daoist monks tend to run up mountainsides carrying 50-kilo stones on their back as part of a spiritual discipline. They can be extremely grumpy and difficult. So when they run into a poacher or an illegal logger, they let them have it. And therefore they patrol their biodiversity, their nature, in an amazing way. Now, so when we did that survey, we estimated that there was between 5 to 6 million visitors, tourists per year to each of the major mountains. Now it's getting close to 20 million. And this phenomenon of the growth of pilgrimage is a mark of the contemporary world. It absolutely is, because people are looking for something deeper. And pilgrimage has risen 200% around the world, and the ecological impact of that is enormous. So with the Daoists, we pioneered the first ever green pilgrimage. And if you go to Luoguandai, which is the historic site associated with Lyza writing the 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, you will find an almost entirely green city that has been built on Daoist lines by the government in order to deal with the, for example, 250,000 people who come for weekends, where you follow the old Chinese almanac and study the fact that every fortnight there's a different title for it. So one of my favorites, because I know exactly what it means, is there's one in spring which says the day that the bed bugs wake up. There are other ones which is the time when the birds make their nests. Another one that is when the fish start to mate. It's this wonderful sort of sense of us within this bigger nature. And the Luoguandai Daoists run these weekends for literally 250,000 people come out to re-engage with nature, and it is all done ecologically. But then I now head Faith Invest, which works with the major religions on their investment portfolios, helping them shift. At the moment, we're shifting about $1 trillion worth of religious investments. Said it wants to be involved in investing in sustainable work. And the Daoists have been very involved in that. And so this is taken from their document on investing. A key concept in Daoism is the balance of yin and yang. They represent two but complementary forces in the cosmos. Though the two forces compete with each other, inside each one is the seed of the other. Without one, there will not be the other, in the same way as there cannot be death without life or shadow without light. Only when they are in balance can the world prosper. And then the three treasures of Lao Tzu cast a clear light on the path to prosperity. To have compassion towards oneself, other people, and this living planet. To live in simplicity, keeping our use of resources to the minimum and avoid exhausting nature's generosity. And finally, to refrain from competing with others, meaning not just other people, but other species and future generations. Is not just something that needs to be put back into the heart of the Chinese culture, which is beginning to happen. I think it's actually something we need in the heart of our culture too.